Ranking every Survivor fire making challenge worst to best. Keep track of my rankings and let me know if you agree with me down in the comments. At the number 15 spot, we have Becky versus Sandra. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say this is one of the most cringe-worthy and embarrassing single moments in Survivor history. Not cringy in a fun way, but something that hurts to watch for how awful this fire making performance is. I debated putting it in first place just for how laughable it is. Both Becky and Sandra have zero idea what they're doing here, and Jeff is not having any fun with it. It needs to be remembered this was the classic sassy Jeff and not the heartfelt Jeff of the new era.
The game is kind of like the monster in a horror movie.
Before we go any further, ranking all 15 fire-making challenges in Survivor history, we need to give a little bit of context. We will of course cover all the controversial, forced fire-making challenges that began with Survivor heroes versus healers versus hustlers, but we'll be diving deeper as well. We will also cover every Survivor fire-making challenge before season 35 that was the result of a tie vote. Think the amazing Carolyn versus Rodney and Danielle versus Saree. However, we will not be covering the fast fire challenge that has appeared across 5 old school seasons for either reward or immunity. We will not be covering the fire and water seesaw challenge that appeared in the Australian Outback and All-Stars. And lastly, as most people try to forget the Island of the Idols, we will not be including the fire duel between Elizabeth and Rob.
I was prepared to up the ante. But like every new Survivor player, they bite at the first opportunity.
Number 14, Ben versus Devin. This would be the controversial introduction to the forced Final Four fire-making challenge in Survivor HHH that would ultimately give Ben the win of the season. This is the only fire-making challenge in Survivor history that I would argue is impossible to objectively rank. In the moment, you can't help but jump up and down for the underdog story of Ben having one last chance, but at the same time, it doesn't feel fair at all. All the non-forced fire-making challenges happen naturally from the tie vote at the Final Four, and after season 35, all the players were aware of the forced fire making twist, but no one knew about it this season, and that's the big problem I have with this one. If it wasn't a surprise twist at the finale and the players knew going into it, this challenge would be ranked much better. Number 13, Mike versus Cara. So our bottom 2 spots were given to a cringeworthy challenge and the most controversial challenge. Both can be seen as either good or bad depending how you feel about them. However, this fire making challenge in Survivor David versus Goliath is objectively bad simply from how boring and pointless it is. First of all, the challenge has no impact on the story of the season, and on top of that, it wasn't a close duel as Mike had a clear lead the entire way through. Number 12, Ian versus Jen. All the way back in 2004 with Survivor Palau, we see the first ever situation of a fire-making challenge occurring at the Final Four due to a tie vote. The tribal council itself is super intense with Ian trying to backstab Tom, only for Tom to change his vote to cause the tiebreaker. Once again, the challenge itself is lackluster as Ian is ahead the entire time, and the entire fire duel comes across awkward on TV. This is the first season to include a fire making challenge, so it gets some forgiveness in that sense, but the battle of Ian versus Jen doesn't have the impact of being the first ever fire duel, making it lose some points compared to Steph and Bobby John that we'll be talking about later in the video. Number 11, Mike versus Jonathan. We are at the point in the rankings where we have perfectly average fire making challenges, just nothing super spicy taking place. In Survivor 42, both Mike and Jonathan were able to get a fire going, leaving to the possibility that anyone could win this. And there was also tons of fun discussions going on before the tribal council as Mike was faking everyone out if he knew how to start a fire or not.
Be honest, you start fires a lot, don't you?
I don't know.
Oh, yes, you do.
I don't know.
I think that you've been dealing with fire too long for you not to be a good fire starter.
Number 10, Lauren versus Dean. I view this one similar with Mike versus Jonathan in Survivor 42, as there's just so much going on behind the scenes during Survivor Island of the Idols to add intrigue into this fire-making challenge. Tommy big-braining Nora by convincing her he can't start a fire. We have the feud between Nora and Lauren, as Nora flat out tells everyone who will be competing in fire that night, and DK chillin' being hilarious at the finish line.
For the record, this morning was the first time I made fire the whole game. So I don't know what Nora's talking about. Tommy played her.
Number 9, Steph versus Bobby John. This one deserves to crack the top 10 fire-making challenges in Survivor history simply for being the first ever fire-making challenge and the iconic moment with the downfall of Oolong, and this being the only time without an official merge, as Stephanie would ultimately get absorbed into the opposing Karora tribe. Number 8, Wendell versus Angela. Survivor Ghost Island brought in a whole new way of approaching Survivor with attempting to reverse the curse of past mistakes. Don't get me wrong, this fire-making challenge was obvious from the beginning that Wendell was going to win, but many fans tend to forget Wendell wanting to switch spots with Angela because of the orange curse. Ultimately winning anyway fits the theme of the season perfectly.
You don't care where you sit.
I don't care where I sit.
And you deeply care where you sit.
Absolutely.
Well, if you guys want to switch.
Yeah, I don't. This is okay with me.
Number 7, Aubrey versus Sydney. Survivor Co. Wrong would deliver the final fire-making challenge in Survivor history well before they would force them onto every season a year later. And this fire-making challenge fits perfectly at this spot. It loses a few points for Sydney not putting up a good fight and Aubrey easily pulling away with it, but this challenge makes up for that with the emotional stakes involved. Sydney is emotional after losing. Aubrey was the underdog we were cheering on for the whole season, and she actually came through with the win. And this felt like it was on such a grand scale with whoever was going to win this fire-making challenge was going to win the season. Oh wait.
The winner of Survivor,
Number 6, Deshawn versus Heather. Survivor 41 gave us one of the most intense fire-making challenges of all time, but I have one big issue with it. It's predictable, and if you read into the edit, doesn't have any effect into the story. I put this one right here in the rankings simply for how epic it is to watch in a vacuum without any other information on the season. However, Heather is leading the entire time. Deshawn comes back slowly to ultimately win the challenge, only for Heather's rope to break seconds later. Number 5, Danielle versus Saree. Cracking the top 5 from Survivor Panama Exile Island, we get the first of many disappointing finishes for Saree Fields. We wouldn't know this at the time, but this would be the beginning of Saree exiting the game in unorthodox ways every time she plays Survivor. We also get the formation of Survivor villain Danielle getting trained by Terry on how to start a fire, only to win the duel and betray her teacher the very next day. What separates this fire-making challenge from the rest of the field is how it sets the tone for the finale episode, as the second last episode ended with a cliffhanger and the finale episode kicks off with this duel. Number 4, Maddie versus Bob. Instantly need to give any fire-making challenge that isn't forced a few extra pointers, as it creates more stakes not feeling artificial. Although it's rare to have a fire-making challenge that's close, as most of them tend to be a blowout, the Survivor Gabon fire-making challenge has a few added complexities to it, with Sugar having the dilemma being close to both Maddie and Bob. And at the same time, this fire-making challenge would ultimately decide the winner of the season. Number 3, Carolyn versus Rodney. I think everyone knows what the top 2 best fire-making challenges are. Those are unnegotiable, as those are cinematic masterpieces. But not going to lie, the Worlds Apart challenge comes pretty close. A lot of people place Becky versus Sandra challenge as being one of the best ever, but I believe this instance with Carolyn and Rodney is that challenge done better. They both struggle the entire time, needing extra Flynn and switch back and forth, only for it to be a close finish in the very end. Number 2, Tony versus Sarah. Survivor Cagayan, Game Changers, and Winners at War gave us the best multiple season arc in Survivor history with Cops R Us. And this Final 4 fire-making challenge during Winners at War was the perfect conclusion to that chapter. And that means at number 1, Chris versus Devins. It's just so iconic how Chris Underwood gets back into the game, wins immunity, only to put himself into fire-making with the final boss of the season.